Synchronicity is a beautiful word for a beautiful thing. Originally coined by Carl Jung in 1930, it gives us a word for something mysterious that has the power, if true, to turn our cultural model of the world on its head. It's a shame then that it is one of the most misunderstood and misused terms in popular culture. And not just by the skeptics, but even more so by its devout, sign-drunk believers. In this episode then, I want to give a clear account of synchronicity that is true to Jung's original conceptualization, that's coherent, but that's also rigorous enough to satisfy even if it won't convince the skeptics. After coining the term in 1930, Jung spent the next 2 decades developing the concept with his collaborator Wolfgang Pauli, one of the giants of quantum physics, who won the Nobel Prize in 1945 and was described by Einstein as his spiritual heir. Together, Jung and Pauli published their work in 1952's The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche. In his half of the book, Jung gives us the most neat and concise definition you could ask for. He defines synchronicity as a meaningful coincidence. But it's not the only definition he gives us. He also describes it as acausal parallelism, or, as in the title of his contribution to the 1952 book, as an acausal connecting principle. Or, in a more comprehensive definition, he describes it as the simultaneous occurrence of a certain psychic state with one or more external events which appear as meaningful parallels to the momentary subjective state. So as you can see, like all good terms, it's got depth, and depth, as we know, always requires a little bit of nuance. And this is where things are going to get really interesting and a little bit unexpected for those of you who are already familiar with synchronicity. So what we're going to do here is firstly we're going to unpack the 3 components at play in every true synchronicity. Then we're going to look at the difference between synchronicity with a small s and synchronicity with a capital S. That is the solid, concrete experiences of synchronicity on the one hand, and then the underlying abstract principle on the other. Then we're going to try and tidy up some of the sloppier use of the term after Jung. And all of that is going to give us a steel-manned synchronicity. With that in mind, let's get started with the basics. So according to Jung, for something to be a synchronicity, it has to have 3 separate components. First off, we have at least 2 events, one internal and one external. Secondly, the connection between these events is acausal, which means their connection doesn't come from one causing the other, but something more mysterious. And thirdly, these events happen at the same time. We're going to look at all these using examples, but this third one is the controversial one. It's the one that everyone after Jung seems to have forgotten or ignored, which makes it the perfect place to start. Another good reason to start with this piece of the pie is because it's intimately connected with the term itself. Synchronicity comes from the marriage of 2 Greek words. First off, the prefix syn, meaning together, as in our words synthesis or synonym. And secondly, chronos, meaning time, which we find in words like chronological or chronicle. So synchronicity means together in time, or as Jung rather more poetically puts it, a falling together in time. It's a key element and one often overlooked in popular usage of the term. Synchronicity isn't simply a meaningful coincidence, Jung tells us, but a meaningful coincidence with this alignment in time. You can see this in any of the examples that Jung gives of synchronicity, but here's a fun one from a letter that he wrote in 1945. For instance, I walk with a woman patient in a wood. She tells me about the first dream in her life that had made an everlasting impression on her. She had seen a spectral fox coming down the stairs in her parental home. At this moment, a real fox comes out of the trees not 40 yards away and walks quietly on the path ahead of us for several minutes. The animal behaves as if it were a partner in the human situation. One fact is no fact, but when you have seen many, you begin to sit up. In this example, the fox comes along at the same time as they were talking about this impactful dream of the spectral fox. If the fox had come the next day or later in the walk, then it would have been much less significant. But what makes this a synchronicity is that just when they are talking about this dream of the spectral fox, this real one appears. This element of synchronizing in time, as we'll see, is overlooked not just by New Age writers who pick up on Jung's work from the 1960s onwards, but also by future Jungians. But Jung is explicit about this point. Here I would like to call attention to a possible misunderstanding which may be occasioned by the term synchronicity. I chose this term because the simultaneous occurrence of two meaningfully but not causally connected events seemed to me an essential criterion. I'm therefore using the general concept of synchronicity in the special sense of a coincidence in time of two or more causally unrelated events. The second key component of every synchronicity experience, according to Jung, is that as well as the external coincidence, so in the above example you can think of the fox walking ahead of them in the real world as they're talking about the dream, there's also an internal element at play, and this can be a lot of different things. It can be a thought, a feeling, a dream, or even a vision. This is another very important difference between the Jungian and the popular usage of synchronicity that both its skeptics and its diehards get wrong. Let's use another example to illustrate this. The following is a story of French poet Émile Deschamps at the start of the 20th century. Here's Jung's version of the story. A certain Monsieur Deschamps, when a boy in Orléans, was once given a piece of plum pudding by a Monsieur de Fortescue. 10 years later, he discovered another plum pudding in a Paris restaurant and asked if he could have a piece. It turned out, however, that the plum pudding was already ordered by Monsieur de Fortescue. Many years later, Monsieur Deschamps was invited to partake of a plum pudding as a special rarity. While he was eating it, he remarked that the only thing lacking was Monsieur de Fortescue. At that moment, the door opened and an old man in the last stages of disorientation walked in, Monsieur de Fortescue, who had got hold of the wrong address and burst in on the party by mistake. That is a beautiful example of synchronicity. So we have three events, one in childhood in Orléans, we've got another in a Parisian restaurant a decade later, and then we've got a third which seems to be many decades later in an unspecified location. And this third occasion has all the hallmarks of a synchronicity. So we've got the internal component of it where Deschamps is thinking about Monsieur de Fortescue and he comments on his absence. And then we get the external component, which is this old man arriving uninvited and unexpected at the party. It's a perfect illustration of what we've been talking about. But the story also provides us with a helpful counterexample. Given the way that the term is thrown around today, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the second incident, the one in the Parisian restaurant, was a synchronicity. But it's not, at least not as far as Jung is concerned. It's a hell of a coincidence in a different city, a city with hundreds if not thousands of other restaurants, and here we are with the same dish, plum pudding, ordered by the same man. But notice, there is no internal mental event. There's no thought or feeling which foreshadows the external event that's to come. And so any skeptic is going to point out that given enough time and enough people, such events are bound to happen. They make great stories, but to see them as anything more than that is to make a huge leap. Jung is explicit about this. In the book he writes, "Synchronicity means the simultaneous occurrence of a certain psychic state with one or more external events which appear as meaningful parallels to the momentary subjective state." The third instance does meet this criteria. It is a true Jungian synchronicity and thus much harder to dismiss. And while it might not convince a skeptic, Jung points out that there's something rather more compelling about it. It has the hallmarks of a good synchronicity, with its temporal alignment and its internal and external components. That brings us to the third component of a synchronicity and the truly quirky part of Jung's formulation of it, and that is the acausal element in the equation. This is a central part of Jung's thinking. It's right there in the title of the 1952 piece he wrote with Pauli. His contribution was Synchronicity and Acausal Connecting Principle. In the book, he describes acausal events as successions of chance events that are not subject to the operation of a common cause. So to say that a synchronicity is acausal is to say that neither of the events that make it up, the internal nor the external, could have caused the other in any plausible kind of way. And so, if we don't have a causal explanation, then that's where we get Jung's acausal connection. Let's illustrate this with another example. The following is a famous story from the life of Swedish polymath Emanuel Swedenborg, and here's the Wikipedia summary of the event. On Thursday, 19th of July, 1759, a great and well-documented fire broke out in Stockholm, Sweden. In the high and increasing wind, it spread very fast, consuming about 300 houses and making 2,000 people homeless. When the fire broke out, Swedenborg was at a party with friends in Gothenburg, about 400 kilometers from Stockholm. He became agitated and told the party at 6 o'clock that there was a fire in Stockholm, that had consumed his neighbour's home and was threatening his own. 2 hours later, he exclaimed with relief that the fire had stopped 3 doors from his home. In the excitement following his report, word even reached the ears of the provincial governor, who summoned Swedenborg that same evening and asked for a detailed recounting. At that time, it took 2 to 3 days for news from Stockholm to reach Gothenburg by courier, so that is the shortest duration in which news of the fire could reach Gothenburg. The first messenger from Stockholm with news of the fire was from the Board of Trade, who arrived Monday evening. The second messenger was a royal courier, who arrived on Tuesday. Both of these reports confirmed every statement, the precise hour that Swedenborg first expressed the information. Jungian analyst Jean Shinoda Bolen gives similar examples in her book The Tao of Psychology, where she talks about her grandfather living in New York's uncanny knowledge of someone's death in Japan. The person would appear to him in a dream or in a waking vision, carrying a suitcase. In this way, he would know that they were leaving and moving on. My mother remembers his remarking on several occasions that so-and-so died. My grandfather had seen him on his way with his suitcase. Then, often weeks later, news would come verifying what grandfather already knew clairvoyantly. In these examples, we can see a sort of knowledge from a distance. It would be weird to think of Swedenborg's visions as causing the fire in Stockholm, or of Bolen's visions of people with suitcases causing their deaths in faraway Japan. But it would also be strange to think of a fire in Stockholm causing a vision in Gothenburg, or of someone's death in Japan causing a vision in New York. Naturally, this will lead us to ask the question of what the connection is. And this is another place where we get a common misunderstanding of Jung. Later thinkers will describe an event as acausal, and then they'll go on to attempt to account for it using exactly what Jung was arguing against. They'll invoke what he calls magical causality. You see this a lot in writers who talk about intention manifestation. They might use spiritual language, or they might talk about it in terms of the subconscious, but the result is ultimately the same. They're invoking some sort of magical causation that we can harness to make our dreams come true and have synchronicities on tap. But Jung doesn't think this way. He doesn't think of synchronicity in this causal way that we can harness and manipulate. Instead, he thinks something else is going on. This is where we get his distinction between the concrete and abstract synchronicities. So far, we've been talking about the components of a synchronicity. That is to say, we've been talking about the necessary elements in a single synchronistic experience. Think of this as synchronicity with a small s. It's a concrete example of the phenomenon. But there's another layer to Jung's treatment. He's also talking about the underlying principle. He's talking about this new, mysterious, natural law or principle that these examples are pointing to. Think of gravity. Every time something falls, we can think of that as a concrete example of gravity. But these concrete examples all point to an underlying natural law that we have to wait for Newton and Einstein to get a full grasp on. Jung, working with the quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli, is trying to build a theory of this Newtonian/Einsteinian level of synchronicity. Synchronicity with a capital S. This is what he is referring to in the title of his section of the book, Synchronicity, an Acausal Connecting Phenomenon. Notice he doesn't call it synchronicity meaningful coincidence, because he's being very ambitious and is trying to get to the underlying principle. Where he gets to in his investigation is that synchronicity with a capital S is a separate law to causation. There is something mysterious going on that we don't fully understand, but somehow there is a connection between Psyche and the material world that foregoes restrictions of space and time. You can see the footprint of his quantum physics collaborator here. They formulate a view of the world in which the archetypal level of the psyche has roots which sink into the mysterious depths of material reality. Jung and Pauli are attempting nothing less than the transformation of our entire materialist worldview. They believe that synchronicity points to a new understanding of the world, transcends Descartes' mind-body duality. Ultimately, I think Jung's whole project fails. I think he relies on too many dodgy studies and premises, and his whole endeavour falls with them. That's something I'd like to look at more in a future episode. But for now, I just want to highlight that for Jung, synchronicity isn't something we can manipulate. It's not some magical causality that we can harness, but something without cause. This mysterious acausal something is the third element in every one of Jung's meaningful coincidences. Setting aside all the high-minded philosophical theory, what this acausal piece means practically is that there is no sense of a cause between the internal events and the external ones. Jung in the dreamer talking about the spectral fox in her dream didn't cause the real fox to appear in the forest, nor vice versa. The same goes for the plum pudding. Émile Deschamps' comment on the absence of Monsieur de Forchevaux didn't magically cause the old man to appear. There's something deeper and more mysterious at work, Jung's acausal parallelism. So to recap, synchronicity for Jung is a combination of three things. A coming together in time of an internal and external event, in a way in which neither caused the other, but both by some mysterious mechanism co-occurred. We could leave it there, but there's one more implication from what we've been talking about that I want to draw out. With that in mind, let's play a game I like to call Synchronicity or No Synchronicity. Consider the following example. Listen to the following passage from Jung's book and see if it sounds like a synchronicity to you. I noted the following on April 1st, 1949. Today is Friday, we have fish for lunch. Somebody happens to mention the custom of making an April fish of someone. That same morning, I made a note of an inscription which read, Est homo totus medius piscis ab imo. In the afternoon, a former patient of mine whom I had not seen for months showed me some extremely impressive pictures of fish which he had painted in the meantime. In the evening, I was shown a piece of embroidery with fish like sea monsters in it. On the morning of April 2nd, another patient whom I had not seen for many years told me a dream in which she stood on the shore of a lake and saw a large fish that swam straight towards her and landed at her feet. I was at this time engaged on a study of the fish symbol in history. Only one of the persons mentioned here knew anything about it. Synchronicity or no synchronicity? There's definitely a sense of some meaningful coincidences going on there, as Jung notes in the following paragraph. The suspicion that this must be a case of meaningful coincidence, i.e. an acausal connection, is very natural. I must own that this run of events made a considerable impression on me. It seemed to me to have a certain numinous quality. It's the kind of thing that sign-drunk diehards would call a wink from the universe. It bears a family resemblance to the phenomenon of so-called angel numbers that often passed for synchronicity in New Age circles. That is to say, the idea that numbers like 1111 or other significant numbers are following you around, or that the traffic lights turning green has some kind of meaning or something else of this sort. Or for a strong example, we might think of Deschamps in the Parisian restaurant. Part of the trouble is that the phrase meaningful coincidence leaves a lot of wiggle room for interpretation. Some writers say that it's in the eye of the beholder whether the coincidence is meaningful or not. Another part of the trouble is that Jung kind of monopolizes the whole territory of meaningful coincidence with the term synchronicity. Perhaps we just need another term for these weaker coincidences that don't measure up to the bar Jung sets. At any rate, Jung ultimately dismisses the idea that such coincidences, even when there is a notable series of them as in his fish example, meet the requirements for synchronicity. Continuing from the fish example above and the numinous impressions it can make on us, he writes that the strength of an impression, however, proves nothing against the fortuitous coincidence of all of these fishes. It is, admittedly, exceedingly odd that the fish theme recurs no less than 6 times within 24 hours. But one must remember that fish on Friday is the usual thing, and on April 1st one might very easily think of the April fish. I had at that time been working on the fish symbol for several months. Fishes frequently occur as symbols of unconscious contents, so there's no possible justification for seeing in this anything but a chance grouping. Runs or series which are composed of quite ordinary occurrences must for the present be regarded as fortuitous. However wide their range may be, they must be ruled out as acausal connections. It is, therefore, generally assumed that all coincidences are lucky hits and do not require an acausal interpretation. This assumption can, and indeed must, be regarded as true so long as proof is lacking that their incidence exceeds the limits of probability. So you can probably sense Jung's hesitance in dismissing these occurrences. He's clearly impressed with them. But if he wants to build a theory of synchronicity, a rigorous theory of synchronicity, then he wants to use solid building materials. Hence his strong conditions for synchronicity that we've looked at in this episode. He distinguishes between 2 types of chance event. There's the ordinary workings of a random chance, and then there's synchronicity. Where does that leave angel numbers and other so-called winks from the universe? The answer is clear. As far as Jung is concerned, they're not synchronicities. Maybe they point to another weaker category of meaningful coincidence, but as far as he's concerned, they're not the real thing. And if that means that 90% of so-called synchronicities are illegitimate, his successors may disagree, but as far as Jung is concerned, so be it. Part of what we're seeing with synchronicity is Jung entering the domain of philosophy and leaning into the broader implications of his work. If you'd like to learn more about Jung's troubled relationship with philosophy, then you can check out this video. Or if you want to learn more about synchronicity, then you can check out this video. For now though, that's everything for this episode of The Living Philosophy. I'd like to thank David Pilibosian, Sasha Canton, Thomas, and all the other patrons for their support of the channel. I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.